Hi, we're going to start in a minute or two. We're waiting for people to be admitted from the waiting room. People are still logging in, so we'll start shortly. Okay, I think we'll get going. Um, Welcome to today's panel on the future of corporate climate disclosures. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School and founder and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Thank you all for joining us. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Initiative on Climate Risk and Resilience Law, which is a joint initiative of Columbia's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, the Environmental Defense Fund, NYU's Institute for Policy Integrity, and Vanderbilt Law School. Corporate climate risk disclosure has become an important topic in both financial markets and to the environmental community, as we've all realized that climate change is a financial threat to businesses and to our investments. There are physical risks, like the risks posed to a factory due to rising sea levels, and transition risks as we move from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy, as well as litigation risks. Financial regulators have taken action in the last few years to require companies to tell their investors about these financial risks. And we now have rules from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the state of California and from the European Union, all of which require companies to report certain information about their greenhouse gas emissions and the climate-related financial risks that they face in their businesses. We have an impressive group of panelists today to help us consider what lies ahead in the world of corporate climate disclosures as these regimes come online. Professor Gina Gale Fletcher is a renowned scholar at Duke University Law School, where her research focuses on financial instruments and market regulation. She currently serves on the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee. She previously taught at Indiana University and Cornell Law Schools and practiced securities laws. Joseph Grunfest was a commissioner at the SEC prior to joining the faculty at Stanford Law School, where he's a nationally recognized professor of law and business with deep expertise in capital markets, corporate governance, and securities litigation. Kristen Sullivan is an audit and assurance partner with Deloitte and Touche, where she's worked for more than 25 years and now leads the firm's sustainability and ESG services. She has extensive experience in delivering sustainability risk assessment, governance, strategy alignment, measurement, reporting, and assurance services. Stephen Rothstein is a managing director at the nonprofit Ceres, and founder of the Series Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. He brings 4 decades of experience in government and the nonprofit sector to his strategic work moving capital markets toward climate sustainability. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I look forward to our discussion. Our format is that I'm going to be putting questions to each panelist, but after they answer, the other panelists are welcome to chime in. So I'm going to start by talking about the impact of these regimes. And I want to ask Gina Gale, I wonder if you could comment on the scale of the disclosures that are required. Are we about to be flooded with climate risk data? How will the market absorb that information? And what other effects do you think we might see coming out of these requirements?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk with you guys about this. So just as you mentioned earlier, right? So the SEC's disclosure regime, they adopted their climate disclosure rules. And while we might think that this might end up with a flood of information, really, if you've been paying attention, you realize that the SEC is not leading the race here, right? There's been a lot of other jurisdictions and even private third parties that have been requiring some kind of climate or sustainability disclosures. So as you mentioned, California in 2023 adopted its own climate disclosure framework. Last year as well, the EU finally implemented its corporate sustainability reporting directive, the CSRD, and that is also, requiring mandatory annual sustainability reports alongside financial statements. And then we also have our third-party standard setters like the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, the GHG Protocol, et cetera, the whole alphabet soup of entities that are acting in this space. And so really what we have is that we have regulations that have either been adopted in certain jurisdictions or that we expect to be forthcoming that would be based on some of these third-party standard setters. And then we have the SEC in the mix. And so I don't think the SEC itself is going to result, the SEC's rules themselves are going to result in this kind of deluge of disclosures, but it is kind of showing that this momentum and that tide is there, and this information is going to be put out or is going to be required by various jurisdictions. And so while it won't cause this flood, what I think will happen is that we are going to have a lot more data, and that data is going to keep growing, right? So I guess I'm just kind of pushing back incrementally on the whether it'll flood it, right? But just that we're going to have a lot more of this information. And I think one of the big, a big impact will be, well, how are we going to, what strategies are people going to use? What strategies are companies going to use as they're faced with all this different disclosure, right? These disclosures are not harmonized. Which I know is something we're going to talk about in a bit, but these disclosures aren't harmonized. And so you're going to now have, I think, an impact on what is voluntarily being reported by companies. Companies might actually be starting to pull back on voluntary reporting, knowing that there are now these obligations as to what must be reported, trying to avoid that gaze of the SEC or maybe even other regulators. It might also kind of impact the way in which they use some of this information, right? Some of the data that they do put out, right? One of the things that the SEC is asking the companies to, or requiring the companies to disclose, right, is their internal pricing of carbon, for example. And so as we have more data about how companies are pricing carbon, it's possible that one of the things that we could see is that we have either greater consensus about what the right price of carbon should be, or we have greater consensus about whether or not we are overpricing carbon or underpricing carbon. There is a lot that's going to come from this data that's now being pushed out. And I think that this is just really the tip of it. I think that there are other issues that are going to come up in terms of trying to deal with these multi-framework systems that we're going to be facing if you're covered by the EU directive, if you're covered by California, if you're covered by the SEC, and trying to figure out how to navigate these multiple frameworks, I think is going to be one of the bigger impacts here. But this information is already coming out to some extent, right? It's already here, it's coming out, and now we're just dealing with the regulatory requirements of that and all the different things that come with that. But we do have a lot of this information right now.
So you've mostly been talking about from the perspective of the entities that need to make disclosures. How about the investors who are the intended recipients of this? How do you think the that investors are going to deal with all this information, and what effect do you think it'll have on what they do?
So, I think one of the things that's really interesting is this question of, do the investors even want this information? Is this information going to be decision useful for investors? And I think when we think about institutional investors, which I'll set aside for right now, right? I mean, they're very important, but I'll just focus on retail investors. I think some of my panelists could talk probably a little bit better to institutional investors. And I'll just think a little bit or talk a little bit about retail investors. And I do think that retail investors have been pushing for this information. And given the markets that we have now, I think retail investors are a force that we do have to think about, right? If we think about just even last week or 2 weeks ago, as GameStop reared its head once again, right? It's showing us the force of retail investors and the fact that we do need to be thinking about them in terms of how the markets are working. And retail investors have been asking for this information. They've been demanding this kind of ESG and sustainability information. And I do think that that is having some of the push towards the information that we are receiving. And prior to the SEC's regulation, while this information was out there, as I said, the information was dispersed, it was scattered, it was not consistent, it was not comparable. Different companies were probably responding to different regulatory frameworks or different disclosure frameworks. I won't say regulatory frameworks here, but different disclosure frameworks. And so the information just wasn't comparable. And while the SEC stepping into this space and having its own set of climate regulations won't change that entirely, right? Because the SEC is not comparable to some extent with the EU or even with California, right? They have different requirements. So while that doesn't change that, it does change for SEC reporting companies that are covered by these regulations that we will have the hope being more comparable, reliable, and consistent data coming from these companies. And I think for retail investors, that will be important in helping them think about how they want to invest their money, what types of companies they want to take on. And one of the things that I want to note here is that there have been a few academic studies, and also a study from FINRA that have mixed results as to whether or not retail investors really care about this, right? So on the one hand, we have a study that was put out by Moss, Naughton, and Wang, and it was a part of the SEC comment file as well. And that study said, well, ESG is irrelevant to retail investors. They don't care about this information. They're not really doing anything in response to this information. And then we have another study that came out by Zhu and Watts that says actually retail investors treat ESG information the way they do financial information. And they trade on this news and they trade on this information the same way they would on financial news and financial information. And we have a FINRA Foundation report that supports that as well, saying that retail investors really care about ESG. They really, environmental issues motivate the way in which they transact, the way in which they invest their money in the capital markets. And so I think that this information is, while the results are mixed, I think that there is some strong evidence or some strong inclination that retail investors do care about this. But Michael, I think one of the things that I want to be clear about is I actually don't think retail investors are necessarily going to go out and read this the way. I mean, which retail investor do we really know? Not very many going out and reading financial statements or reading the 10Ks and the Qs, right? The information is there, but they're not necessarily in the weeds on the Ks and the Qs, the 10Ks and the 10Qs in that same way. But we expect the market to distill that information. We expect news outlets and investor outlets to distill this information and make it available for retail investors. And I think that same thing's going to happen here once we have this information being made more readily available for investors.
Thank you. Let me follow up on some of that with Steve. As Gina Gale just said, there are a whole lot of different disclosure requirements out there. They have different protocols and so forth. Do you see a pathway to harmonizing them? Do you think that it's important to harmonize them? What do you see going forward on that front?
Yes. So first, Michael, thank you and the Sabin Center, not just for hosting, but for all the important research and scholarly work you do. Thank you very much. And I do think there is a pathway for that. But let me first talk about investors on the institutional side, then come back to that in a second. So institutional investors, our first meeting with the SEC on behalf of institutional investors with them was in 2003. They've been interested in this literally for decades. Institutional investors fundamentally want more information. The average person that they're investing for, the average person in the United States is going to retire in 23 years. And what the SEC, under many commissioners, including Joe's leadership over years, deserves a lot of credit for was making sure the market has good information. If the market has good information, then we'll have a robust economic growth. And if you look at a few recent measurements, first, comment files to the SEC on the disclosure. There were more comments overall, 24,000, and the institutional investors, there were over 320 comments representing $50 trillion of assets. And we did an analysis. Over 95% of them supported the direction of the SEC. In fact, many want to go further, including Scope 3. So institutional investors also are, by tens and tens of millions, are setting up net zero plans. And they're talking to their companies. The number of shareholder resolutions are growing. So institutional investors definitely care about this. They want more information. And I can talk more about that. Obviously, the work internationally is momentum there. In terms of harmonization, I think of this as phases. 20 years ago, we were BD, before disclosure, lots of information. Now we're in MM, the messy middle, where we've gone from lots of voluntary, which I refer to as kind of a climate Tower of Babel, lots of information, but hard to communicate with each other, to now there is more convergence. If you just look at, SASB's become part of IFRS, ISSB, they have joint arrangements now with CDP and GRI. Apologize, folks, for using the acronyms. So there is more convergence. The SEC clearly is different from California in terms of not even Scope 3, but the underlying elements of using TCFD, of using greenhouse gas protocols are the same. So while Europe, CSRD goes further in terms of double materiality, looking at biodiversity, they're not the same. They use the same principles. So I think that if Sabin Center does the same thing in 3 years or 4 years, we will look back at how much convergence there has been. Not as much as we want. It's still messy. And you asked about investors. So there was a study done by ERM that was submitted to the SEC about during the voluntary time, investors were spending $1.3 million on collecting data. That's an indication of their interest, but it's also an indication that many times companies would be filling out 2, 3, 4 reports because of this alphabet soup. And so hopefully over time, it's not going to happen at once, but over time, there'll be more convergence and more standard. Just as today, we look at financial statements, in the decades ago, doing an audited statement was considered a radical idea decades ago. My hope is in the coming years, we're not talking about sustainability reports, but the sustainability issues are just built into the reports, into the core financial reports. And I'm hopeful we'll get there. It will be messy to get there, though. It will take some time.
You see any particular mechanics or pathway to get to convergence? Or is it just going to happen somehow?
I think first having the underlying elements of TCFD, greenhouse gas protocols is critical. I think one of the things I encourage everyone on this call to think about is over the next year, California is going to write their regulations. So now that the laws are passed, their regulatory agency, CARB, is going to start their regulatory process in the next little bit. I encourage people to be involved and do it directly, do it through us, whatever works for you, because that will be a critical element. If California were its own market, it's the 5th largest market in the world, and then to advocate for convergence with the standard setters.
Just as the California legislature was subjected to a barrage of lobbying before it enacted this law, I'm sure that the California Air Resources Board is going to get possibly an even larger barrage of lobbying on the contents of the regulation. So that'll be very interesting to watch.
Absolutely. That's why, again, I encourage people to raise their questions, submit when they're not at the soliciting comments yet. That's a few months away. But encourage people to do it directly or reach out to us. we will be doing it as well, so that there are comments about the best way to operate this in a smooth and orderly fashion.
Thank you. So, Kristen, you work with a great many clients that have been providing climate-related disclosures for some time already under the voluntary frameworks. How are their practices going to change now that we have this barrage of new mandatory requirements? And what are they doing to get ready, and how will they be affected by these multiple and changing requirements?
Yeah, well, thank you, and good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Really pleased to be a part of the discussion today, a really important and timely discussion. And maybe just building on the comments from Gina Gale and Steve so far, I think this is a pretty game-changing set of developments in the market. And there's a lot of comparisons to the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley and really the internal controls of our financial reporting and really the distinction, which is companies have been at this for a long time. We've got 98, 99% of the S&P 500 who have been providing this information to the market voluntarily. The rates of obtaining voluntary assurance have been increasing for a number of reasons, but really moving to a truly well-governed and controlled environment where you have an ability to understand, establish governance, prioritize, measure, and disclose in a timely and investor grade manner takes a lot of time, right? And I think the continuing evidence, as was mentioned by a fellow panelist, just that investors increasingly use this information. And some recent research, just to add to the mix of stats, that 92% of asset managers rely on this information, but remain dissatisfied with the timeliness, comparability, and the quality of the information. Another study indicated that 87% of investors believe there's some form of greenwashing included in this type of information that's provided voluntarily. And I think it's important to remember, right? Greenwashing comes in different shapes and sizes, right? It's not just an intentional misrepresentation of information, but in some cases, without an effective control environment and governance structure, the absence of certain information, incomplete information, can influence decision-making of investors in particular. And so I think this move from what has been largely voluntary, but really strengthened due to the strategic imperative, the risk and resilience considerations, moving to a regulated set of obligations is really, served as this catalyst for companies across all jurisdictions to really rapidly accelerate their preparedness. And so we talk a lot about 2024 being really this year of readiness. And now we're well into the second half of 2024. When you look at just mapping out these disclosure requirements that most large global multinationals are subject to, namely the European disclosures that will likely come into force sooner. In some cases, the California disclosure requirements may come into force, depending on the profile of the company. But when you think about the preparedness activities and what's really, really important to weave into these activities is the fact that assurance over this entire universe of information will go into effect as of the first implementation dates. And so I think the way we're talking with many and working with many of our clients impacted by this broad universe of disclosure regulations is really that, beginning where you are. Again, this is in most cases, companies are reporting some information, right? Understanding that they've had pressure from stakeholders or commercial pressures or legal or regulatory or other pressures that have prompted this increase in disclosure. And it really, I think, puts that emphasis on this whole concept of materiality and a systematic, disciplined, well-documented approach that can evidence conclusions that an organization makes about what are the priority risks, opportunities, and impacts of the business. And so it really is a bit of, starting where you are and making sure you have the right voices around the table from a governance structure to really understand and take a much more thorough approach and systematic approach to what these priority risks and opportunities are, so that you can put in place the right controls and governance around these matters to accelerate more timely investor grade, and then ultimately disclosures that will meet the regulatory compliance obligations. Maybe just double clicking on this whole emphasis around materiality, which is really the starting point for every organization when you think about, regardless of where you are on the maturity spectrum. In particular, if you have obligations across the EU set of disclosure objectives, this concept of double materiality and really stepping back, it's either strengthening the processes that you already have in place, putting new practices in place, engaging new stakeholders in a manner that is in accordance with the criteria that's established by these new standards. And then really trying to overlay this concept of interoperability with, back to the point, I think, on the convergence of standards, thinking about the international sustainability standards and the foundation of what some call single materiality, or more traditional financial or investor materiality, that there's a lot of work that companies really need to do and be really thoughtful and take the appropriate and sufficient amount of time to understand, evaluate, actually execute on these activities. And again, getting back to making strategic choices and decisions and conclusions, and making sure you're documenting so that you can evidence those conclusions and how they actually drive the set of disclosure objectives that will meet your compliance needs. And I think that's why this whole emphasis around, again, this game-changing area of assurance, that process in and of itself will be subject to assurance, and an independent third-party assurance provider will need to perform and conclude on the sufficiency of that process in accordance with the criteria established by the standard that underpins the disclosure requirements. And then naturally, once you get to a place where you've got that materiality determination process really strengthened, established, operating in a manner that's repeatable, that really helps to establish then the disclosure objectives, and thinking about, how do I really either enhance, strengthen, or in some cases establish governance and control processes. We now have, out of COSO, well known in the financial reporting space for internal controls over financial reporting, the framework that guides the way in which corporate reporters put that control environment test and execute against a really strong control environment for financial reporting. We now have guidance, the internal controls over sustainability reporting, ICSR. And so really helping companies apply that guidance, the emerging practices that you put in place that become necessary around this broad universe of risks and data that are inherently different in many cases than many elements of the financial statements, when you've got different subject matter, different units of measure, different forms of data uncertainty. And really that's where the standards become so critical to guide really establishing and prioritizing that control environment. So I think the practical steps really come down to that materiality determination, the control environment, and really that governance and capacity building that are so incredibly important to actually execute and deliver in these really constrained timelines.
Thank you. Very interesting. I want to turn to Joe and focus on the SEC rules for a moment. During the rulemaking process, you urged the SEC to recognize and, to a certain extent, rely on the disclosure requirements of other jurisdictions, such as the requirements we've just been talking about. The Commission seemed to show little interest in doing that. Do you think they missed an opportunity? I'm wondering how you think the rulemaking could have come out better, and do you see going forward some prospect that they'll go closer to the recommendations that you made?
Mike, let me start by saying I'm a strong proponent of climate disclosure. I think it's essential that the world understand where these gases are coming from, and that we have enough data to deal with this problem intelligently. That said, if the SEC adopts a rule that's simply going to be vacated by the courts, the SEC has accomplished nothing. The rule that the SEC has adopted, with all due respect to the agency, is a train wreck. Isn't a chance that it will be upheld by these courts, and accordingly, I deeply fear that it adds nothing to society's need to address this extraordinarily serious problem. If one simply looks at the Fifth Circuit's recent decision in the private funds rule, and if one simply comprehends the approach that our Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit and other circuits are taking towards the interpretation of agency statutory authority, and especially with the risk to Chevron that's coming down the road, we'll learn more about it by the end of this Supreme Court term. If you are making a book on the probability that these regulations withstand judicial review, it would not be a pretty over-under. Let me explain why. Simplest argument. Here's the minimalist explanation for why these rules will go down. It has nothing to do with the major questions doctrine. One can even stipulate that the federal securities laws, if read in isolation, would support the SEC's rulemaking. The problem is totally different. There's a separate doctrine by which the Supreme Court explains that if Congress has spoken more clearly that a particular issue is to be regulated by a different agency, then it can divest a prior agency of authority. And this has happened on multiple occasions to the SEC. In particular, the Clean Air Act of 1970 gives authority over emissions measurement and disclosure to the Environmental Protection Agency. More recently, if one looks at the Inflation Reduction Act of 2023, you see 2 budget allocations to the EPA expressly for the purpose of supporting measurement of corporate disclosure. There is a huge difference between requiring that entities go in and measure their emissions under the authority of the Securities Act and the Exchange Act, and requiring that companies report information that is already in the public domain. It will be trivially easy for the courts to say that the SEC has no authority to require that any company measure scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, or scope 1 million emissions under any way, shape, form whatsoever. That's a very easy opinion to write. And if one wants precedents, just have a look at Teamsters versus Daniel. There's a case where you had pension funds that invested in stocks in the S&P 500. Nothing is more clearly a security than investing in stocks. But the Supreme Court said because Congress gave authority over pension funds to the Department of Labor, that was one of the many reasons why these pension funds were going to be regulated by DOL, not by the SEC, and they weren't even called securities. Other examples in the banking sector, at the Supreme Court level, at the district court level, again, a trivially easy opinion to write, vacating these rules. Now, there's an element of sadness and regret I have here, because there is, as we academics say, there was a Pareto superior alternative. The SEC could have accomplished even more. We could have had better disclosure to all investors that would also have included scope 3 disclosures, would have been lower cost for all of the registrants, and simply would have gotten us more information in a way that would withstand review. But the SEC decided not to do that. And I think the reasons why it decided that were essentially political, that it was under a lot of pressure. And, look, I'm a centrist Democrat, but it was under a lot of pressure from the left wing of my party to go as aggressively as it could. It decided that it was going to go in the direction it did, which was certainly not as far as many people wanted. But again, in my view, and speaking as a practicing lawyer, as somebody who makes predictions and stands by the predictions, it does no good to adopt a set of regulations that will simply be dictated by the court, especially when there is an alternative superior. And just very briefly, the superior alternative says, look, any company that has disclosed its emissions, either voluntarily or because of EU regulations or California regulations or the FAR regulations, which are extraordinarily important and get very little attention, simply aggregate that information up in a good faith manner, report that information in one place in a way that will reduce search costs for professional investors and for retail investors, and that will promote capital efficiency and organizing the disclosure of information that's already in the public domain is well within the authority of the SEC if it's efficiency enhancing, which is the case here. And you then would have had scope 3 disclosures, right? Because EU is going to require that. You would be importing all of the assurance and validation disclosure requirements, that Ms. Sullivan has spoken about. And we would have in one place a very neat, easy little package that would be showing you the carbon equivalents of all of these different disclosures. This is a huge missed opportunity, but it is what it is.
So, Joe, you've been focusing on the emissions disclosure requirements there, but of course, there are also the financial impact disclosures. What are the impacts that climate change and its regulation will have companies? And EPA doesn't regulate that. Do you have a similar prediction for how the court will come out on those kinds of disclosures?
Very different. Very different. There, I think there's a higher probability that those discussion and disclosures and analytic requirements are going to withstand a judicial review. So what I do is I take the rule, I break it into two parts. You've got the quantitative emissions disclosures, and you've got the qualitative analytic disclosures. The qualitative disclosures have a much higher probability of withstanding review. The quantitative disclosures, DOA.
So I'd like to ask the other panelists, do any of you have different thoughts on the probability of the quantitative disclosures surviving the inevitable lawsuits?
So I'm not a lawyer, so I just a caveat, but have obviously talked to a lot of lawyers, read a lot of legal briefs, and with enormous respect for Joe, come to a different conclusion. And part of the reason, that the SEC picked, I don't want to speak for the SEC, but they focus on scope 1, scope 2, as well as the financial. The scope 3 is more complicated, and some argue it was further afield from their mandate in terms of the supply chain. So I think by picking the more narrow one, a narrow option, I think it will help with the final legal elements. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's what lots of thoughtful lawyers have said, and I hope that that's right, and with all due respect.
Well, Steve, I know the lawyers, I've had the conversations with them, and what's really interesting is the way I describe it is these supporters, including many of my academic colleagues, they squint at the law. Because if you read all of their stuff, all right, you read Jill Fish's stuff, which is the best, Jack, all of that stuff, read it carefully. Let's assume everything in it is totally correct. I'll stipulate them. Let's assume that if the federal securities laws were the only relevant laws, you would have authority. I'll stipulate to that, but here's the problem. It's not true. Congress also enacted the Clean Air Act, and it also did the Inflation Reduction Act, and it'll be trivially easy. And I'll tell you, even more, I've talked to these people and I've said, how do you write this stuff without talking about the Clean Air Act a whole bit? And they simply won't respond. Because if you include that in the analysis.
So the Clean Air Act requires scope 1 disclosures from a lot of companies, and the scope 2 disclosures tend to be the scope 1 disclosures of electric utilities and so forth, and those are disclosed. But there are a lot of scope 3 disclosures that nobody has to disclose. So, for instance, the principal scope 3 emissions of an oil company are the use of their fuel by the motorists, but individual motorists have no reporting obligation. So those kinds of emissions would completely drop out if only the EPA reporting requirements are involved. So are you instead relying on what the scope 3 disclosures of California and Europe?
Aha, exactly right. My proposal would capture everything, not just merely the EPA. So the reality is the EU disclosure requires scope 3. So any company reporting under EU would also have to report under US law. More importantly, California, separate conversation to be had. There'll be litigation over supremacy clause. I get it. Closer call. I think that California's rule will survive. I think there's some interesting provisions structured, around EPA regulations and a whole bit in states' rights. It becomes a thornier issue because you've got a conflict between states' rights and federal supremacy. But I think California requirements likely survive. Much more intriguing, the federal acquisition, all right, regulations. If the federal government, and I see Steve shaking his head, and Steve, I'll ask you to explain how important these are and how little attention they've received. I think this is the place where the information equilibrium is off. If the federal government succeeds with the FARs, which would require scope 3 disclosure, just about anybody that does more than $50 million a year of business with the federal government, that's pretty much everybody in the economy. You then get huge scope 3 disclosure, which under my proposal would be rolled in to the SEC disclosure. Steve, you want to talk about the FARs?
Sure, Michael, if that's possible. So under so the federal government's the largest purchaser of items. They bought last year about $750 billion worth of, from paper clips to helicopters and everything in between. They proposed that for 98% of the suppliers, that there be no requirement whatsoever. That if you sell less than $7.5 million of things, if you sell between 7.5 million and 50 million, you do scope 1, scope 2. These are draft rules. They haven't issued the final yet. And if you're above 50 million, it's also scope 3 and a transition plan. There are about, and it's hard to get exact data, it's about 1,000 companies that are above that 50 million. So it would have an impact. We hope that those get finalized in the coming days. And that would be an important step forward. One of the issues I know, Joe, is the question of having information in a consistent place and having XBRL be able to tag it with Edgar. But again, I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
So is it your sense that those regulations might be issued in final form in the near future?
We are advocating for them. We're hopeful. I don't know, but we're hopeful.
Okay.
Yeah, so had the SEC adopted my rule proposal, you'd be able to go to one place on the SEC website and you would see an integrated report of all of the information that the company has put out, whether it's under the FARs, under the California rules, under the EPA rules, under the EU rules, under China's rules, under British rules. You take all of that information, you aggregate it up in good faith, and you have a simple description of where do we stand, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And that'll be more information than we're going to get under the current SEC rules, right? Especially because the quantitative part of those rules, in my view, with all due respect, are going to go down in flames.
So, Kristen, you mentioned assurance a couple times, and we know we have different kinds of assurance. We have limited assurance, reasonable assurance. Can you just spend a couple of minutes explaining what those two are, what their significance is, and what role they play in the rules we're talking about here?
Sure. And maybe just a point of reference in connection with this dialogue so far. And, I think a big part of obviously what the ambition of a number of these developments, these regulatory developments, is really this fundamental premise, as I know was stated from the outset, that the risks related to climate change are creating measurable financial impact. And so that emphasis on connectivity of information that's being assembled and provided through many, many different avenues. How, what's the market infrastructure necessary to drive that greater discipline? And that's where assurance comes in. that also helps advance us towards that greater understanding of integration into financial reporting and financial analysis. And so I think this sort of, assurance to audit continuum is part of this, acceleration in the market. But when you step back and think about information that's provided to the market outside of the financial statements, that's where this whole role of assurance, the attestation standards by the professional bodies, come into play. And I think given that assurance is such a central feature of a number of these developments, in particular the ones we're talking about, the EU, the CSRD, California, and the SEC, there's a very clear recognition that assurance delivers enhanced reliability, enhanced confidence, enhanced timeliness, that gives users of this information an ability to understand where maybe inherent bias might have been and how that was navigated, how completeness really takes form in an overall reporting process. And so I think we've seen through these regulatory developments how the two forms of assurance, or the two levels of assurance, have been introduced in a sequenced manner. So when you think about limited assurance, again, on this information outside of the financial statements, it's generally at a very high level, sort of equated to what a quarterly review of financial reporting would look like in terms of a negative conclusion, right? Nothing's come to our attention based on procedures like inquiry, analytical procedures, select additional inquiries and evidence gathering to conclude that nothing material has arisen that would suggest that the user would not be able to rely on that information, again, based on a risk profile. And that is the predominant of practice in the market. We definitely are seeing the evolution of reasonable assurance evolve in the market in this voluntary landscape. But today, the large majority of voluntary assurance that's obtained is at that limited assurance level. I think the regulators recognize that limited assurance is not going to be sufficient for future reporting that is very much aligned and integrated into broader financial reporting, where this reasonable level of assurance is generally equated to sort of the audit of the financial statements at a reasonable assurance level based on reducing the level of risk to an acceptable range, where it's a positive conclusion, right? In all material respects, the information is presented in accordance with the criteria. And that requires a different profile of risk considerations, procedures. The main distinction is that there's an evaluation not just of the control environment around how this information and risk is understood, how standards are applied, and how the overall process is conducted and concluded with a well-governed process. But when you move to reasonable assurance, it's that understanding of the control environment that's required by the assurance provider, as well as testing the controls that are in place in terms of are they designed to meet the objective? Are they operating effectively? And when we think about the maturity in this non-financial ESG climate disclosure landscape, every organization is on a journey and accelerating quickly. And so I think regulators recognize that there does need to be an appropriate sequencing of the assurance requirements to allow preparers, companies, to mature their processes in a manner that will withstand the independent assurance. And so it gets back to the points that I was mentioning previously, that preparing through an assurance lens and recognizing that there's just a different level of policies, procedures, controls, documentation, evidence that needs to be considered as companies accelerate their preparedness and understand what the risks really are from a disclosure perspective.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Gina Gale a question. We know that many companies, and as this has been mentioned, are making net zero pledges. And these net zero pledges just about all rely heavily on offsets, because very few companies are ever going to be able to get their emissions down to zero. So they need to have offsets to counteract that. There are, in all of these new regulations, requirements for disclosures about about the use of offsets, and California has a new statute specifically on voluntary carbon markets. How do you think that these disclosure requirements are going to affect the actual making of net zero pledges and the use of offsets and what the offsets are going to look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think what's going to end up happening here is, as we have more of these regulatory requirements about what we're disclosing and how we plan to, how we price carbon, or how we're meeting some of these pledges, which will come up to some extent in some of our disclosure, right? Because if we're making these promises, then we're going to need to start showing something in how we in what we're disclosing in our sustainability report about whether or not these pledges are being met, which right now one of the complaints that's rampant about these pledges is we have no way of tracking. We have no way of tracking whether or not you're on course. We have no way of tracking whether or not your carbon offset program is actually working. And I think that a lot of this data might get us a little bit closer to knowing that information. I do think, though, Michael, to answer the question that you're asking, how is it going to impact these pledges? I am a pessimist at heart and by nature, and I do think it's going to probably result in some of these pledges getting companies being less public or less forceful about these pledges. I think once you have a world in which more data is being provided about how you are about your carbon emissions, about how you're pricing carbon, how the price of carbon impacts your business. Once we have a lot more of this information, and what mechanisms you're planning to use in order to get to these net zero pledges, which, like you said, Michael, we're not going to get there by just not emitting, right? We're going to do it by using offsets. And offsets are already in a very questionable lens or lane right now, as we're taking a closer look at carbon offsets and realizing, and some of us are just realizing, but some of us have always realized that carbon offsets are problematic because they're not doing a lot of what they say they're supposed to be doing. And so when you combine these two things, you have carbon offsets on one hand that are being allegedly, or some are saying are being manipulated. They're not doing the work that they're supposed to do, and you have companies saying that they're doing this net zero pledge on the reliance of carbon offsets. And now we have more disclosure, right, overall about your sustainability reports. And I think that's going to have a much finer lens being given to these net zero pledges. And I think it might result in some companies being less vocal about these net zero pledges, maybe being more thoughtful about when they really do think they can make these net zero pledges, and about when they can accomplish these net zero pledges, rather than kind of, being a bit more, I don't want to say blasé, I'm sure they're thoughtful now, but definitely being more thoughtful with an eye to the potential litigation that can come from their disclosures and not being able to make some of these pledges.
So do you expect that a lot of companies will roll back or withdraw their net zero pledges? And do you expect that there'll be a lot less use of offsets going forward?
Well, so one of the things I hope is that maybe offsets can become more useful, but I do think that will require actually a whole new way of thinking or regulating the carbon offset market right now. But I do think that possibly companies will be, maybe they'll either roll them back, or they'll just be less vocal about them, right? It'll just silently kind of maybe disappear a bit, unless this is something that the company is really committed to, and does have a plan that doesn't just rely on offsets. I do think it will require companies to think more broadly because of the limits of legitimately using offsets right now.
Thank you. The word materiality has been used a lot in this conversation, and single materiality is just on is financial materiality, but then when we get to double materiality, we talk about the environmental impact, either narrowly on climate change or in Europe's case, many more impacts. But California doesn't seem to be requiring materiality at all for their disclosure requirements. What effect will that have when a lot of companies are going to have to comply with the California law to be disclosing their emissions and the financial impact, even if there's no determination of materiality?
So I can jump in. Again, I think the details answer will be determined by CARB and the regulations, but generally theirs will be more inclusive because they don't include materiality. So there won't be that threshold of just the very major things as part of that. So I think that will give a more fulsome picture of there. Obviously, it also includes scope 3, as we talked about. The other thing about California is that it includes both public and private companies, where the SEC doesn't. So that's interesting. I think just quickly on carbon, just following up with what Gina Gale was just saying, is 3 weeks, maybe it's 4 weeks ago, Secretary Yellen and Secretary of Agriculture and others announced a new set of principles, not requirements, but principles for carbon offsets. I think there were 7 different things that they identified, which I think are all good. So I think we need to head to more standardization for those so that you're looking at the full life cycle. You're looking at are they verified, the impacts on indigenous populations. So their work, the work of ICVI and others, I think are very important. Gina Gale mentioned, I think she said she's a pessimist. I'm an incurable optimist. So I think we're going to see more verified, maybe even assured, but at least verified third-party carbon offsets. And the more you do that, that will lead to a growth in that market, because we do need, from a nature and biodiversity, to address these issues in a thoughtful but in a measured way. And again, to address the needs of local populations.
Yeah, and, look, and along those lines, let's not forget the FAR regs, right? Which again will pick up non-public companies and don't have a materiality limitation. Again, that just reinforces my point that the SEC would simply curate, aggregate, roll up, and rationalize all of these other different disclosures. They would have more information than they even proposed in their initial rule, which they cut back. This is mind-blowing.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I'd be interested in hearing from each of you what you see going forward. If we have this webinar again in 3 years, where do you think the regulators and the private sector will be on climate-related financial risk? What do you hope that we are going to be talking about next? I'll go in the same order, so I'll start with Gina Gale.
Yeah. So what do I hope that we'll be talking about next? Well, I think actually what I will do is I will borrow from my fellow panelist, Stephen, and I will say I hope that the carbon markets becomes one that we can rely on. I do think that there's a lot of promise there, but I think that the way it's operating right now is problematic. And so actually one of the things I hope in 3 years is that Stephen's right. I hope that we will have that growth in that market because of the assurances that Kristen's talking to us about and that has told us about, that gets bled into that market as well. And so then we are having the next stage of these discussions about how to achieve some of these our net zero pledges, how to achieve, how to lower our carbon emissions in more meaningful ways, and not just disclosing our emissions, but really talking about reducing them in a meaningful way going forward.
Thank you. Stephen.
In 3 years from now, I hope we're not talking about should there be disclosure, but what is the disclosure telling us? What does it say about companies' governance and risk management and scope 1? And so we're utilizing that information. And a preview of that is the insurance industry. Tomorrow, we're publishing a report with the 2nd year of TCFD analysis. So again, the discussion there is not should there be disclosure, but what is it telling us? Also, I hope not within 3 years, but over a little longer term, that we're not referring to separate sustainability reports, but they're so built into the financial reports that it's just part of the day-to-day financial analysis.
Thank you. Kristen.
Yeah, well, I just kind of building on these points, I think getting to an ecosystem that moves beyond this concept of convergence and interoperability of the standards that underpin risk identification, materiality determination, and disclosure criteria, to a place where the fragmentation that seems to be evolving across regulation is much more streamlined in terms of anchoring on a common set of global standards that give companies that clarity direction in terms of really activating the governance and practices around the reporting process to make it efficient, right? And get to moving from interoperability to an equivalence regime where companies have that certainty. I think what that will do is really help to provide the transparency and standardization to unlock capital flows to really motivate, value, and incentivize companies to make these strategic choices and move more quickly towards decarbonization. And then finally, that boards would be highly engaged throughout the process. And that's what we are looking to see.
Thank you. Joe.
You tell me who wins a presidential election, and I'll tell you what the world looks like in 3 years.
Okay.
If Trump wins, right? If Trump wins, forget about it. All right, you'll have a new SEC. It won't be a modest SEC. You can forget about enforcement of many of the rules, and you can see them rolling back the rules that were just adopted, whether they are affirmed by the courts or not. It's not going to be a pretty sight. People aren't thinking clearly about this. And then even if the SEC stays, in place and you have, a new Biden administration, the quantitative rules simply won't be there. And if we're lucky, what they'll do is they'll pick up, a proposal similar to mine or my proposal, and we'll have a different flavor of disclosure. And we will, in many ways, actually have better disclosure than what the SEC has actually been proposing. But it will be delayed, and we will have spent a lot of time and money and angst on litigation and on lawyers.
So regardless of what happens in November, of course, we'll still have California. So those rules will still be there and the European rules will still be there. So won't we still have a lot of this disclosure?
You'll have a lot of disclosure, but then you've got a lot of the additional costs of, wait, I got the California disclosure, I got the FAR disclosure, I got the EU disclosure. How do we make sense of all of these different things? All right. When you see Kristen shaking her head going, yeah. But if the SEC had adopted my approach, Kristen would be going, woohoo, this is easy. You see, I just go to one place, I got the numbers, it's all reasonably aggregated. There you go, I'm done. All right. But you have all of this other stuff. It's going to be a tower of environmental babble. But on the other hand, it'll be a lot of work for Kristen, and she'll get paid for aggregating all of this stuff and making it comprehensible to investors. Unnecessary cost and expense, not efficiency enhancing.
I'll just put in my 2 cents because we're out of time, that I think we'll also see a lot more focus on the physical risks of climate change. It's been predicted that this is about to be the worst hurricane season ever. The Northeast is about to have a big heat wave. If Trump wins, we'll have more oil drilling and less pollution control. So the supply chain impacts, many other impacts are really going to be very severe. And I think we'll have more focus on the physical impacts of climate change. But I hate to end on such a down note, but we are out of time. I want to thank Gina Gale and Kristen and Steve and Joe for very interesting conversations. Sign up for the Sabin Center's mailing lists, where we have put out a lot of additional information. Thank you all and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.